We begin this lecture by looking at one of the most famous stories in Greek mythology, the Judgment of Paris. The story begins with Zeus, the supreme Olympic god, hosting a banquet at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, the future parents of the Greek hero Achilles. Zeus fails to invite Eris, the goddess of discord. Out of spite, Eris decides to disrupt the festivities by coming anyway, and she brings a special object to the event, a golden apple from the famous garden of Hesperides. The apple is inscribed with the phrase, "For the fairest one." She tosses this apple into the crowd and leaves the rest to her understanding of Greek goddess vanity. Immediately, three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, lay claim to the golden apple, each declaring that she is the fairest of all. The goddesses demand that Zeus decide which one of them deserves the apple. For once, Zeus is smart, and he refuses to judge between them. Instead, he passes the choice on to Paris, a mortal prince of Troy. Paris finds it difficult to choose between the goddesses, and on the sly, each goddess tries to bribe him with a gift. Hera offers to make him ruler over all Europe and Asia, and Athena offers him wisdom and skill in warfare. But Aphrodite appeals to his baser instincts, and she offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris is persuaded by this, and he declares Aphrodite the winner of the golden apple. I like to think of this as the original Miss Universe pageant, a contest that brings out the worst in almost everybody involved, including some backstage intrigue and corruption. More seriously, this story highlights a classic element of Greek mythology, the importance of the goddesses in both the divine and the human realms. Last time, we spent a lot of time focused on the guys in Greek mythology, the Titans and their descendants. In this lecture, we're going to focus on Greek goddesses, particularly Aphrodite and Athena, because their personalities and their interactions with the gods and with humans are crucial to Greek mythology and to Greek understanding of human nature. We'll see that these goddesses are complex characters. They're powerful and yet morally flawed, fulfilling many common stereotypes of women while simultaneously wielding great influence. We begin with Athena. Athena was perhaps the most important Greek goddess of all. As the Judgment of Paris story suggests, she was known as the goddess of war. While Ares, the male god of war, was associated with bloodlust and violence, Athena was associated more with the statecraft of war, its use as a political weapon. Think of Ares as the god of dodgeball and Athena as the goddess of chess. Athena was not an emotional warrior. Her chief concern was politics, and she's known for empowering leaders, primarily men, with the skills they need to negotiate politically difficult situations effectively. Athena tends to display sophisticated calculation and strategy skills rather than sheer bloodlust. Some have said she represents ennobling war, that is, righteous war waged to protect family or the city-state, known as the polis. She empowers hero warriors, not simply with strength and weapons, but with intelligence and cunning. For example, Athena is the goddess who comes to Odysseus' aid when he returns from his 20-year journey to and from the Trojan War, disguising him when he returns to the city so that he can surprise his rivals. In doing so, she not only upholds the hero, she also upholds the institution of the family. Athena's mythological origins are interesting, and they provide some insight into her unique role in Greek mythology. Zeus, Athena's father, is warned that a child of his will be born who is superior to him. In an effort to prevent that child's birth, Zeus swallows the child's mother, Metis, while she is pregnant. Now remember, Zeus's own father, Cronos, had swallowed all of Zeus's siblings in an attempt to prevent them from rising up against him. So clearly swallowing runs in the family as a preferred coping strategy. When Athena is born then, she emerges into the world from her father, not her mother. In addition, Athena emerges full-grown and fully armed from Zeus's head, an unnatural birth, and one that marks her as having a close relationship to Zeus. While she has political savvy and cunning, all of her abilities are put to Zeus's service. She's the original daddy's girl. Athena never really uses her abilities for her own advancement. She's her father's first lieutenant, his right-hand man, as it were. Athena is also linked to legal courts. In fact, she is credited with establishing the original trial court in Athens in order that justice might be done in a dramatic case. According to Greek legend, a mortal man, Orestes, murdered his mother, Clytemnestra, who herself had killed her husband, King Agamemnon. Agamemnon had incurred her wrath by sacrificing their daughter, Iphigenia, to appease an angry goddess and to enable the Greek fleet to set sail for Troy at the start of the Trojan War. According to the story, the king, Agamemnon, spent 10 years away from his throne, fighting at Troy. Unfortunately, his wife, Clytemnestra, began an affair with Agamemnon's cousin during his absence. And when Agamemnon finally returned, Clytemnestra murdered her husband, hacking him to death in the bath with an axe. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, then returns to his father's land after a long exile, and he vows to avenge his father's death. After considering whether or not to actually do the deed, Orestes ultimately stabs his mother. At this point, Orestes begins to be haunted by the Furies, female spirits who cry out for vengeance against the man who killed his own mother. In fact, Orestes' family is accursed, and multiple family members have killed one another, and it seems as if this cycle of bloodshed and vengeance will never end. Finally, Orestes turns to Athena for aid. Athena ends the cycle of vengeance by establishing a court to hear Orestes' case. This court, often called the first in Athens, is assembled to hear the case brought against Orestes and to render a final judgment. In this trial, Orestes' defense is that any child belongs more to the father than to the mother. Therefore, in killing his mother, Orestes argues that he was rightfully avenging the murder of his father. The human judges become deadlocked in their verdict, and Athena ends up casting the deciding vote. She agrees with Orestes' view on filial loyalty, and she acquits Orestes of any crime. Athena's logic is that defense of family ultimately means upholding the father's will. As a goddess, Athena is all business, and she has no real erotic appeal worth mentioning, although the Judgment of Paris story indicates that she is stereotypically vain about her looks. Unlike almost every other Greek goddess, Athena never takes a consort, so she is known as Athena Parthenos, or the Virgin Athena. The famous Greek structure known as the Parthenon, originally a temple built to Athena, is understood by many scholars to refer to Athena's virginity. The ancient Greeks would have understood the term virginity to refer to her independent social status, which was highly valued socially and in certain ritual contexts. Think of Queen Elizabeth's power as the Virgin Queen. No man ruled over her. In this case, no god ruled over Athena, except one could argue her father Zeus. Since Athena is a virgin, she also never gives birth, although certain myth variants give her children by other means. Hephaestus, the craftsman god, tries to force Athena to have sex with him, but she escapes. When she does, his sperm falls to the earth, and Gaia, the goddess of the earth, becomes pregnant instead. Eventually, Athena becomes foster mother to this child, Erichthonios, who is guarded by a serpent. In a variation on this story, Gaia actually gives birth to the serpent itself, as well as to the child. In both cases, Athena is given the child to foster. Erichthonios is said to have eventually become the first king of Athens. Instead of fulfilling a traditional mother's role, however, Athena serves as the patron goddess of the city-state Athens. She's usually depicted armed, helmeted, carrying a shield and a spear, and wearing an aegis, a fringed bib, probably made from an animal skin with the head of a gorgon on it. The Iliad says that her aegis was ageless and immortal. 100 tassels of pure gold hang fluttering from it, like tight woven each of them, and each the worth of 100 oxen. It's thought that the aegis acted as a kind of a protection for Athena, and it's a concrete sign of her other role, that of a warrior. The goddess Aphrodite provides a sharp contrast to Athena. Like many of the gods, Aphrodite has a long, rich history, predating the classical Greek period, which is generally said to have lasted from about 500 to 323 BCE. We know that it was fairly common for ancient Near Eastern cultures to include a love goddess of some kind or another, and Aphrodite myths certainly seem to draw from these traditions. Some scholars believe that Aphrodite has roots in the goddess referred to in the Bible as Ashtoreth, the main goddess of the Phoenicians. This goddess was associated with fertility and nature, but by the time Aphrodite emerges in Greek mythology, she's become associated with love, not just biological fertility. Aphrodite is a well-developed character in Greek mythology, and there's a large collection of stories about her, ranging from her birth through a lively adulthood. There are different accounts of Aphrodite's birth. According to some traditions, Aphrodite was born on Cyprus, near Paphos, which was her primary center of worship. Other stories state that she was born near the island of Cythera. In yet another story, she is presented as the daughter of Zeus and Dione, a female Titan. Hesiod presents the most colorful story of her birth. He states that she was born from the foam, created when Cronos castrated his father Uranus and threw his genitals into the ocean. Her name reflects this myth. Aphrodite literally means arisen from foam. Aphrodite was carried to shore on a scallop shell, and that's why her Roman counterpart, Venus, appears standing naked on a large shell in Botticelli's famous painting, The Birth of Venus. Like Athena, Aphrodite springs to life as a fully formed, beautiful young adult woman. Because of this, and because she's the goddess of love, she's often portrayed nude. She is also characterized as vain, self-centered, and willful. I often think of her as a 20-something Paris Hilton, wealthy, beautiful, and completely self-absorbed. She is constantly seeking praise and attention for her beauty. And although she's married to Hephaestus, she is also constantly involved in amorous relationships with a wide variety of other men. Most of the mythology centered on Aphrodite centers on the combination of her beauty, her vanity, and her wild love affairs. Aphrodite's best-known love affair is with Adonis, the Fabio of Greek mythology. The most detailed story about Aphrodite and Adonis appears in Book 10 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. According to the myth, a mortal woman, Myrrha, refused to worship Aphrodite. As punishment, Aphrodite made Myrrha seduce her own father. When her father discovered that he'd been sexually involved with his daughter, he almost killed her. But the gods took pity on her and transformed Myrrha into a tree, a myrrh tree, and Adonis was born from that tree. Aphrodite brought him to the god Hades so that the goddess Persephone, whom we'll discuss in more detail later, could raise him. When Aphrodite returned to visit him, Adonis had grown into a drop-dead, gorgeous young man, and Aphrodite fell head over heels in love. Aphrodite and Persephone began to fight over him until finally Zeus interceded. In an attempt to resolve the problem, Zeus decreed that Adonis would spend a third of the year with Persephone, a third of the year with Aphrodite, and the remaining third of each year with whomever he chose. Not surprisingly, Adonis chooses the beautiful Aphrodite. They begin their time together, but at a certain point, Aphrodite is forced to leave Adonis for a brief period, and she warns Adonis not to hunt any animal that appears fearless. Adonis quickly forgets her warning, and he hunts a large wild boar. The wild boar turns on Adonis, castrating him, and Adonis eventually dies from loss of blood. Aphrodite returns too late to save him, As a memorial gesture, she causes anemones to grow where his blood spilled, and she establishes an annual festival to be held in his memory. This myth displays several of Aphrodite's most important qualities. First, of course, she's beautiful, which is why Adonis chooses to spend time with her. Second, however, she's extremely self-centered. We've seen this already in the Judgment of Paris, and her vanity comes out again in the stories linking her with Adonis. In this cycle of myths, she directs all of her energy toward Adonis, completely ignoring the fact that she's married to another god. Not that the Greek male gods were models of fidelity either. In addition, it's suggested that the wild boar that attacks Adonis is actually the god Ares in disguise, angry because he himself was Aphrodite's lover until Adonis came along. In general, Greek mythology indicates that Aphrodite's unfaithfulness causes lots of difficulties for others. This is most clear in the aftermath of the Judgment of Paris. After Aphrodite wins the golden apple, she makes good on her promise to Paris and brings him to Helen of Sparta. Paris either seduces or abducts Helen. Different versions give different accounts, but in any case, Helen leaves her husband and is taken to Troy, thus sparking the most well-known war in Greek mythology. This story makes clear the full extent of Aphrodite's vanity. Bottom line, she causes a world war just to win a beauty contest. Aphrodite is the original femme fatale, causing the death of thousands of men just to stroke her own ego. Over the centuries, the character of Aphrodite evolved a bit in Greek mythology. By the late 5th century BCE, philosophers began to argue that there were actually two Aphrodites. The first is the celestial Aphrodite, born of the sea foam. This goddess is ethereal, serene, and beautiful in a look but don't touch kind of way. The second is the common Aphrodite, whose parents are Zeus and Dione, and whose vanity and sexual exploits leave a trail of ruin. The Neoplatonists, a 3rd century philosophical movement, invoked the distinction between the celestial and the common Aphrodite in their own philosophical work. The Neoplatonists taught that there is a singular one, or a good, beyond all being, and this good informs ethical behavior. They argued that the celestial Aphrodite should be associated with spiritual love, which is associated with the purifying virtues, while the common Aphrodite should be associated with physical love or desire, which ties the soul to sensuality. I'll discuss Hera, the 3rd goddess involved in the Judgment of Paris, in a moment. But what do we learn about Greek culture from the mythology surrounding Athena and Aphrodite? A little bit of history might be helpful here. Athena actually has a long history prior to the Greeks. Plato associated her with a minor Egyptian goddess named Neith, who is linked to war and the hunt. This Egyptian goddess had roots going back to pre-dynastic Egypt. As time passed, Athena developed into a goddess associated with various arts and crafts, including metalworking. It's possible that this led to an association with weaponry, which is made of metal, and eventually to an association with warcraft. As the ancient Greek city-states coalesced, distinct communities tended to identify specific gods or goddesses as their patrons. Deities assigned the task of protecting their region. One myth asserts that Poseidon and Athena competed for the right to be the patron deity of Athens. Athena won by offering the people of Athens the olive tree, symbolically offering the fundamental resources of wood, oil, and food. In any case, as Athens rose in importance, so did the deity associated with the city. But it's helpful to remember that Athena originated centuries earlier as a simple hunter goddess. If these historic connections are accurate, then Athena's history goes back centuries before she becomes the center of a worship cult in classical Greece. Aphrodite's roots are a little less clear. As I noted earlier, some scholars have linked her with Phoenician, Assyrian, and Etruscan religious traditions, but there's no clear lineage. What does seem certain is that Aphrodite has historical roots in the religious traditions that preceded the Greeks, and it's clear that other gods and goddesses have similar pre-histories. When we think of these histories, it becomes easier to see that Athena and Aphrodite, like the other Greek gods and goddesses, are exhibit A and B for the fact that the Greeks absorbed elements of the cultures around them, and then they tailored these elements to their own needs. In other words, the Greeks were masters at appropriating the cultures of the communities that nurtured them, as well as the communities they encountered through trade and military conquest. The Greeks took cultural elements from all of these communities and made them their own. And Athena and Aphrodite are classic examples of this dynamic. This raises an important point about myths in general. We tend to think of myths as springing fully formed into specific cultures. And most of us think of the ancient Greek myths as, well, Greek. But the Greeks drew heavily from their predecessors and neighbors, just as later cultures, especially the Romans, would draw from them. Because of this, it's best to think of mythologies as living entities, always on the move, shape-shifting as they pass from culture to culture. Turning back to Athena and Aphrodite, it would be tempting to use the goddesses as a kind of a bellwether, reflecting the experiences of real women in Greek society. After all, Athena and Aphrodite play a wide range of roles. Isn't it natural to assume that real ancient Greek women were free to do so as well? Unfortunately, this is not the case. The Greeks, for all their advanced ideas, maintained very limited traditional roles for women. Women weren't permitted to be active in Greek government or in public life, and their status was determined completely by their fathers or their husbands. Women simply were not equal to men, despite the important role that goddesses such as Athena played in Greek civic life. The goddesses, unfortunately, are not a reflection of ancient Greek feminism. Instead, it is far more accurate to think of Athena and Aphrodite as contrasts to the real world that mortal Greek men and women inhabited. Once we realize that Athena and Aphrodite don't reflect reality, we're free to notice that, in fact, these two women figures never actually play any traditionally approved female roles. Neither of them is born as a baby. They both spring into existence as full developed young women. They never get to be Greek girls, and even as adults, they don't play traditional roles. Athena never marries. She never even takes a consort, and she never gives birth. Her responsibilities seem to lie elsewhere, in war and in upholding justice. Aphrodite, by contrast, is the embodiment of sexuality. She's constantly seducing or being seduced at the same time that she's married. Athena is the warrior virgin. Aphrodite is, shall we say, loose. And these goddesses stand out, at least in part, because they don't live the lives of ordinary Greek women. Here we should note that other goddesses may come closer to reflecting women's lives in ancient Greece. But even when we examine these other female figures, the picture isn't reassuring. For example, consider Hera. Hera was married to her brother Zeus, and she represented marriage and childbirth. However, she's got her own set of problems. Zeus was a well-known philanderer, and Hera spends much of her time angry because of his very public infidelity. This is not a woman who stands by quietly. Instead, Hera goes ballistic on her husband, his mistresses, and his children. And some scholars have suggested that uncomfortable relationships between the goddesses and the gods may reflect some historical cultural dynamics that we'd prefer not to know about. The dysfunction we see between the gods and the goddesses may reflect genuinely difficult dynamics between Greek men and women. We know that marriages among the leading families were largely politically and financially driven, and women were not equal partners in those marriages from society's point of view. This probably led to significant tensions in certain households. I imagine that Greek high society marriages may have been more like The Good Wife than the Cosbys. Other scholars view the relationships between gods and goddesses more metaphorically. Now, these scholars will argue that the tensions played out between individual gods within the myths symbolize broad cultural dynamics. For example, Hera's difficult marriage to Zeus can be understood to reflect the difficult merging of pre-Hellenic culture and the conquering culture that eventually prompted the development of classical Greek culture. In other words, Hera and Zeus don't represent human beings. They each represent entire cultural communities, clashing as they interact. Carl Jung argued that Greek mythology used external conflicts between individuals and communities to express the cultural trauma experienced by pre-Hellenic culture when invaders occupied the Greek islands. Take, for example, the story of Persephone's rape. According to the tradition, the virgin Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, the god of the underworld, and held captive against her will. Ultimately, she was tricked into staying with Hades for half the year perpetually. Well, according to Jung, the story of Persephone's rape isn't really about physical rape at all. Instead, it represents the rape of pre-Hellenic culture. Now, while this approach may be a bit extreme, it's not unreasonable to think that stories of the goddesses spoke to anxieties and concerns that resonated with entire communities, not just with individuals. Some scholars argue that goddess figures like Aphrodite diminish steadily over time, so that by the time we reach Homer and Hesiod in the 8th century BCE, they've largely been relegated to supporting roles as wives, lovers, and mothers to the gods. But while the goddesses for the most part lose their cultic centers, their mythology has actually survived for thousands of years. This leads us to our final question. Why do the myths of the goddesses persist? What do the myths of the goddesses have to offer us today? Given the strong personalities and colorful adventures of the Greek goddesses, it's tempting to turn to them as role models for the modern era. Could Greek mythology offer an alternative to monotheistic patriarchy? Sadly, I think the only honest answer is no. Overwhelmingly, Greek goddess mythology, while fascinating, tends to reinforce traditional patriarchal dynamics in several ways, as we've already seen. In addition, the goddesses find themselves in stereotypically female quandaries, competing with one another for the love of a god or a human man, fighting on behalf of their children, and fending off would-be rapists or suitors. The goddesses' problems probably mimic the problems of ancient Greek mortal women, whose lives were driven in large part by the choices of their fathers, their husbands, and even their sons. Hera, Zeus's wife, is constantly dealing with the consequences of his infidelities. Goddesses and mortal beauties are pursued by suitors for their looks alone. Often female beauty becomes the provocation for conflicts between individual gods, men, or entire city-states. Greek mythological heroes are rewarded by being given the girl. It's like watching the worst of network television. In most of these scenarios, the Greek goddesses have little to no choice. But it wouldn't be fair to characterize the Greek goddesses as completely passive victims. They put their hurt and anger into action, and it's not pretty. Poor Hera spends most of her life trying to punish Heracles, her husband's bastard son. Aphrodite turns Medusa's hair into snakes, just so Medusa won't be pretty anymore. In many cases, the aggrieved goddess often goes to extreme lengths, becoming very difficult to empathize with. Some scholars argue that in these women, we see the antecedents of harsh European folktale figures, such as the cruel stepmother figure and the wicked witch. Other attempts have been made to use the Greek goddesses as poster women for feminism. French feminist Hélène Cixous argued in the 1970s for a reappropriation of Medusa as a powerful, positive role model for women. Other feminists have actually rewritten some of the Greek myths to give female figures more control over their lives. In one revision, Helen of Troy is no longer a kidnap victim. She chooses to leave her husband to follow her own lustful desires, which are not being satisfied at home by her elderly husband. It's clear that any one-size-fits-all approach fails to capture the full breadth and complexity of the Greek goddess mythologies. However we interpret these myths, the stories of the goddesses, in addition to being highly entertaining, offer several insights into Greek culture. And we may simply have to be satisfied with that.